Hi, I'm Jonathan Neville. We're listening to Gospel Tangents.
It's the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to have Jonathan Neville on the show. It's about time we talked about the Heartland theory, and so Jonathan's a bit of an expert on that. I was surprised to find out that at one time he was a big proponent of the Mesoamerican Book of Mormon geography theory. So check out our conversation. Well, welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to have a Heartland expert on the show today. So could you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. My name's Jonathan Neville, also known as Jonathan Edward Neville, as we'll understand in a little while. And do you want a little of my background? Or?
Yeah, so
Okay.
I know you're a lawyer, but yeah, give us your academic history.
I'm a retired lawyer now, but I've been a lawyer for many years, as well as an educator and businessman and author. And so in my work, I've traveled all over the world, and I finally, about 6 or 7 years ago, I was actually working on a novel involving Native Americans, and someone said I need to meet Rod Meldrum.
Oh.
That's how I got involved with all this.
So back up, we got to find out where you went to school.
We got
to go all the academic history.
Okay.
Yeah. Not high school, but college.
Okay, college. Well, I did go to high school in Arizona, though.
Okay.
And then I went to BYU for my undergraduate was agricultural economics.
Oh, wow.
I got a master's degree in agribusiness, which is basically an MBA specializing in agriculture.
You must be a big Ezra Taft Benson fan.
Oh yeah, sure.
It was kind of similar.
Yeah, well, it was the Ezra Taft Benson Institute that I was involved with, and went to law school at BYU also.
Okay.
And I did a little post-law school work up at University of Washington in Seattle.
Okay. Well, cool. So I will say, some people are going to say, so what would qualify a lawyer to delve into Book of Mormon geography?
You know, I get that question a lot, and my answer is lawyers delve into cases all the time. You know, I've had a variety of different cases. I used to do criminal prosecution as well as defense. Mm-hmm. And anytime you get a case, we analogize it to filling a bathtub. We fill our minds with all the facts of a case, and then when that case is over, we pull the plug, drain it, fill it with another case, right? And so in the process of that, we have to learn details about all different aspects of a case. Could be scientific, could be even historical, whatever. We do a lot of interviewing of expert witnesses and things where we have to learn really what the science involved in a particular case is. And so I approached this whole thing initially as a case in church history. And I don't know if you want me to get into that part of it yet, but the very first book I wrote was about church history. And the question was, well, let me back up a minute. After I met Rod, he showed me all the kind of the Heartland theory in general. And I said, well, why did we ever look in Mesoamerica in the first place?
Well, weren't you originally a Meso guy? Didn't you tell me that? You were all on board with Meso,
totally.
And then you switched.
Yeah, well,
so tell us about that.
I've had an interest in antiquities and geography since I was a kid, because we were living in Europe and we were visiting Greece, and we were in Athens at Mars Hill. And my father said, you know, you're standing where the Apostle Paul stood. And I thought, well, I heard of Paul, but I didn't know anything about him. You know, I was like 15. Oh, okay. Maybe I was 14 or 15. But he showed me in the Bible, and I read the account of Paul in Acts where he was at Mars Hill, and I thought, wow, this is amazing that where the Bible was talking about, I was standing right there. And so we had been to Rome and the catacombs and, you know, all the various things and related to the Bible, and I just became real interested in it from that point on. And so when I was at BYU, I took classes in Book of Mormon, of course. I had a class from John Sorensen, and I had a real fascination with all of the Central American stuff.
And John Sorensen is the dean of Meso, right?
Right. He wrote the Book Mormon's Codex, which was kind of his final book, a big, thick book, all about the Mesoamerican ideas. I visited Central America in subsequent years in many areas, and so I was all in. I used to go to the farms conferences. I read all the farm stuff. You know, I have all the BYU studies all the way back from the 80s and so on.
You know, we went on a cruise to Belize.
Yeah.
Have you been to the place called Lamanai, which sounds a lot like Lamanite?
I have been.
Yeah.
In fact, when I went to Lamanai, we just rented a car. We were up at Cancun. Uh-huh. We rented a car, drove into Belize, because I don't like the tours as much as doing it on my own. Oh, wow. And so we
Do you
drove.
speak Spanish?
Un poco. I speak French.
Belize is English, so that's
Yeah,
nice.
it is. It's mostly English, and so it was not a problem to get around in Belize.
Right.
And I can get around in Mexico. I went to France on my mission, so I speak French.
Okay.
And I've served in a Spanish branch as a branch missionary, intercity missionary. And so I know enough Spanish to get by.
Okay.
But anyway, so we drove out to Lamanai, and it's pretty fascinating, and a bunch of other places down there. And so, and back then you could just explore these ruins. There were no security or anything like that. So I've climbed over ruins all through Yucatan and Belize and down in Guatemala and stuff. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I was totally all in. And it was, part of it was, I guess, being deferential to my professors, because all the BYU professors taught the Mesoamerican stuff back then. And I read all the books. You should see I have a huge collection of everybody who's published anything on Mesoamerica. And it wasn't until I met Rod. Actually, I saw a presentation by Wayne May before I met Rod. And I thought, wow, I've never heard of this stuff before, right? Mm-hmm. But I was kind of skeptical, because he threw a lot of stuff on the wall, and some of it sticks and some doesn't, And
Wayne May you're talking about.
Wayne May. And since then, I've gotten to know him really well and appreciate much more of what he's been doing. But at the time, I was just one of those things, a gospel tangent, you could say, that... But when I met Rod, it was a little different, because he said, if you really want to understand this stuff, you should come on a tour. And I thought, well, I've been to all 7 continents. I've been to all over the world on various activities for work or for pleasure or education. And I thought I'd never been to Ohio, really. I've driven through it. And so I went on his tour.
On Rod's tour.
On Rod's tour. Rod and Wayne were there, and it just totally blew my mind, really. I just had never even conceived of the Book of Mormon in that setting before. But we went to the museums, I saw the artifacts, I saw the explanations and so on. So I asked Rod, well, this seems so obvious. How did we ever end up in Central America? And he said it was because of these articles in the Times and Seasons in 1842. And I had been familiar with those because they're in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, so everybody assumed that Joseph wrote these articles. And that's where I kind of became... put on my lawyer hat, so to speak, and said, I want to analyze this like a case, a mystery, you could even say. Who wrote these articles? And so I really delved into that. That was my first foray into church history in any detail. And that's where I came up with the Benjamin Winchester approach, that my assumption is, based on the historical evidence, that Benjamin Winchester wrote those articles and was sending them out to Nauvoo for William Smith to publish in the Times and Seasons. And that was kind of my first introduction to the whole apologetic thing, because I met with some of the apologists.
What year was this approximately?
I'm going to guess around 2000, what would it have been? 2016, 2015, something like that.
Oh, so you're a recent convert.
Yeah, it's pretty recent.
Oh, wow, I didn't realize
that. I was oblivious to the debates about the geography, really, because I just assumed the Mesoamerican. I didn't even know there was an alternative. I'd seen once in a while someone mention a map around New York or something, but I'd never paid that much attention to it, because it seemed to me that I knew a lot of these scholars from when I had been at BYU and reading their materials and BYU Studies and The Interpreter, all these magazines. And I thought, well, these guys must know what they're doing. It just wasn't on my radar until I saw this alternative. When Rod showed me these things and Wayne explained them to me, and then I started doing, my attitude is trust but verify, right? So I heard Wayne, Rod, I thought, okay, that's interesting, but I want to know for myself. So I started delving into it. But the first thing was the church history. So I met with, I don't necessarily need to name people, but I met with some of the well-known apologists and talked to them about this Benjamin Winchester idea. And one of them in particular really fought me on this. I published some articles in The Interpreter and all that. And I thought, well, what they didn't know...
So he didn't think Benjamin Winchester wrote these?
Oh, no. And the
thought they were Joseph, or...?
They thought it was Joseph Smith.
Okay. Because
he had published an article based on stylometry. And he said, well, the only 3 people who could have done it is John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Joseph Smith. And when he did the stylometry analysis...
Not Phelps?
Not Phelps. He didn't even consider Phelps.
Okay.
At the time, people didn't think Phelps was in Nauvoo in 1842. that came later. People realized, oh, he was actually there, but we're not sure when he arrived and so on. And so he did this article and published it. I don't remember where it was published, but I looked at it, and the articles in the Times and Seasons on his matrix, he had a 3-dimensional graph of the stylometry, and the articles in the Times and Seasons were kind of off in a corner. They weren't really close to Joseph John Taylor, or Wolfwood Woodruff. And so I said, well, it looks to me like someone else wrote these articles, none of those three. And that's when I started investigating it. And I kept coming across this Benjamin Winchester, who I've never heard of before. He's kind of a minor player in most church history, but it turns out he played a really significant role in church history that people didn't know about.
I'm trying to remember. If my memories are correct, why can't I think of his name? Brian Hales talks about him because he's involved in polygamy too, I think, right?
Yes. His sister was one of Joseph's wives, apparently. And Benjamin Winchester was a very devout, he was the youngest adult he was like 15 on Zion's camp, he and his father.
Oh.
And he and his father stayed with Wolfwood Woodruff and 2 others back in Missouri to work on a brick house some guy hired him to do in order to raise money to help the saints. So he was all in. When he finally went back to Heartland, they ordained him an elder and then a 70. And he was a very valiant missionary. He started a newspaper in Philadelphia called the Gospel Reflector. And he was close friends with Joseph Smith. In fact, when Joseph went to Washington, D.C., he stayed in Philadelphia for a while. And in the journal it says he stayed in the same bed as Benjamin Winchester. They were just really close friends. And Winchester's father was, we don't need to digress, but he was also a very faithful member. So Winchester was all in. In fact, he was campaigning for Joseph Smith for president in the southern states. And then we found out his sister was one of the polygamous wives. That kind of turned him off, let's say, from the church, and he became an antagonist. Okay. He wrote a fairly aggressive anti-Mormon article that was published in the Salt Lake Tribune. And he characterized Joseph Smith as all these terrible things, which was, in hindsight, he wrote that because at the time he was totally devoted and convinced Joseph was a prophet. The reason he wrote the Gospel Reflector was he was trying to rebut all the anti-Mormon Eastern press, but they wouldn't publish his letters to the editor. And so he finally said, well, I'm going to start my own newspaper so I can rebut that. And he did. He was very effective at it, but it only lasted for 6 months.
Oh, okay.
And what I found that I hadn't known was in the Times and Seasons, there was numerous anonymous articles being published in 1841, 1842. And they were all from the Gospel Reflector. Winchester had written and published them in the Gospel Reflector, and then the Times and Seasons picked him up, but didn't put his name on it. And so once I realized that, and I did an analysis of all the material Winchester had written, it turns out he is the second most prolific contributor to the Times and Seasons, other than Joseph Smith. And in fact, in the very first issue of the Times and Seasons has a long letter from Benjamin Winchester. So he had a long history with the Times and Seasons, and I'm kind of digressing maybe from your question.
Was Phelps in Missouri at the time?
Phelps had, let's see if I can remember the time right, he had been in Missouri, but then he was estranged from the church for a while, and then he came back, remember? Okay. And so historians weren't really sure exactly when he moved to Nauvoo. And I know some people think he was there in early 1842, others late 1842. And there's some indication that he was there roughly June or July, if I recall correctly. There's either a letter or someone referred to him being there. And so Phelps, we don't know for sure how involved he was with these newspapers. But William Smith was publishing the Wasp, starting, as I recall, is in March or April of 1842. And that was a newspaper that his brother Don Carlos had wanted to start. And he had been raising money to start this second newspaper, but then he passed away. I think it was in August of 1841.
Don Carlos passed away.
And so William Smith was there, and he wanted to kind of revive his brother's project, so he started the Wasp. And it was published at the printing house, the same printing house that published the Times and Seasons also published the Wasp there in Nauvoo. And William Smith was known as the editor and founder, basically, of the Wasp. And so when I put all this together, I thought, well, wait a minute, if William Smith was the editor and publisher of the Wasp, he could have also been working on the Times and Seasons. And the only, well, I don't know if we're digressing too much from the main thing, but I'd love to talk about all this. So the Times and Seasons, Joseph Smith took over in March of 1842. And the background of that is, in 1841, Benjamin Winchester in Philadelphia had heard that Don Carlos died. And he wrote a letter to Joseph Smith, and he said, "I'm so sorry to hear that. I wonder who can take his place." And at that time, his newspaper had kind of collapsed because of funding. He didn't have the money to do it. And so he moved to Nauvoo in October of 1841. And then he started working at the Times and Seasons. But he caused a little bit of consternation, I guess, or problems, to the point that in January of 1842, they kicked him out of the Times and Seasons and basically kicked him out of Nauvoo. So he went back to Philadelphia.
What were the problems?
They didn't really specify. They just said we don't want him working anymore here at the newspaper. And I think it was because, maybe it was, at least I assume it was because he was promoting his own agenda more than what people wanted. But he was also a very irascible, hard to work with person. He was the branch president, which was like a bishop back then at the branch in Philadelphia. And he would excommunicate people that disagreed with him about doctrinal things. And it got to the point where Joseph sent Hiram out to Philadelphia to correct him. But back then they had an elders quorum kind of and a branch presidency, which were separate. And one was ecclesiastical, one was more financial. And so there was some conflicts involving church organization. And one of the things Hiram Smith did was kind of reorganize how that organization was set up in response to Benjamin Winchester and his. At one point, Joseph Smith recorded that, or wrote, I think it was in the Council of the 12 Minutes. He said that Benjamin Winchester is valiant and awesome, but you can't get him out of the course that he's in. He was very. There's lots of other quotations about Benjamin Winchester. In fact, later on, he and William Smith had been good friends and close friends. But later on, when William Smith had moved to New York and he was running the Prophet newspaper, and Benjamin Winchester was back in Philadelphia, they had a big battle, and William Smith excommunicated Benjamin Winchester. But then he got involved in litigation.
William was pretty irascible himself.
He definitely was. But Winchester sued William Smith, and William Smith wrote a letter to Brigham Young asking him to say such and such to help him in his lawsuit. I mean, it's a fascinating history we don't have time to get into.
Wow.
But the point is that Winchester was very outspoken, let's say. But he was also very erudite in the gospel. He wrote a book called The History of the Priesthood. And another one was, I have to remember what it is, but it was the first real LDS concordance of the scriptures. And John Taylor recommended missionaries have access to it because he went through and have a topic and then he'd give you the reference in the scriptures. And so when he was writing this gospel reflector, he wrote, as I mentioned, lots of articles for it that were later published in the Times and Seasons. But he also republished Oliver Cowdery's 7 letters, or his 8 letters, which were the first church history. It was originally published in Heartland. And he asked Joseph Smith if he could republish them because by then Oliver Cowdery had been excommunicated. And Joseph Smith said, by all means, republish these, it'd be great. And Sidney Rigdon also agreed that they should do it. So that was one of the significant things. That's what led me to Benjamin Winchester, or part of what led me to it, was understanding these 8 letters that Oliver Cowdery had written. And when I saw they were in the Gospel Reflector, and lots of other things led me to see Benjamin Winchester's influence on the Times and Seasons.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jonathan Neville. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about Joseph Smith. Joseph was the editor of many church newspapers, and there are some claims that he endorsed the idea of some Native American sites related to the Book of Mormon in South America. Did Joseph really endorse that idea?
The only explanation I've seen for believing that Joseph Smith was the editor was the boilerplate at the end of the newspaper.
Right.
It said it was...
Although that's pretty significant.
Yeah, right. Well, here's the thing about the boilerplate. It said the Times and Seasons is printed and published and edited by Joseph Smith. No one thinks he was down there setting type or running the printing press, right?
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents for just $5 a month. Patreon is spelled patreon.com/gospeltangents. If you'd like to watch the entire video, you can subscribe at YouTube, Patreon, or on my website at gospeltangents.com and click the yellow subscribe button for just $8 a month. PDF transcripts are just $10 a month, and you can get those on patreon.com/gospeltangents or on my website. I'll send those to you as soon as I've finished completing it. If you'd like to get a paperback and PDF, just subscribe for $20 a month at either Patreon or on my website. Individual paperbacks are available at amazon.com. Just do a search for Gospel Tangents Interview, and you can find all of our past interviews there. Show your Gospel Tangents pride by purchasing a t-shirt on our website at gospeltangents.com/shop. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. You can get our latest updates by friending me at Facebook, or you can also follow our page at facebook.com/gospeltangents. Become an insider and you can see the newest videos. Follow us on Twitter at Gospel Tangents. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.